Thank you very much, Rajshri. And I'm really honored by this opportunity which has been given by celebratingindia.org. Uh, they are really doing a good job. They've made a good start. So I hope that God will bless all your efforts. Now she started the celebratingindia.org to preserve or rather highlight, showcase India's culture, heritage, and ancient Indian knowledge. So this is a good job. May God be with you.
Thank you.
Before we start, let us say a small Vedic mantra, which essentially says that may God remove all that is bad from us and bring in all that is good. ॐ विश्वानि देव सवितर्दुरितानि परासुव यत्भद्रं तन्नासुव ॐ शान्ति शान्ति शान्ति. Welcome, dear friends, to this presentation on secrets of our past. Uh, of course, we are going to look at some of history, but I must first start with a disclaimer. I am not a historian, but I am an engineer, and that scientific background, I think one cannot get rid of. So, what you will find is that I will be telling you a little bit about what I could say history, scientific history. uh, I am not studying history per se. I am more into a spiritual endeavor and studying ancient Indian philosophy for spirituality. But Indian spirituality, ancient Indian spirituality, I should say, is of such a nature that it encompasses all sciences, all arts, all eternal knowledge is to be understood to proceed on the path of ancient Indian spirituality. So, during the course of this time, I discovered some of these facts, which today I shall be sharing with you, which I felt were extremely fascinating, mind boggling, if I may use the expression. And I felt that most Indians didn't know about it. When I talked to people, then they didn't seem to be aware of it. Maybe some of you might find that you know some of the things which I will be presenting, but I'm sure that you will have something to take away. So let me start by showing you this statue, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with. Most of you might have gone to Konark and might know that on four sides of the Konark temple, you find four different statues of the sun god. This picture is, in fact, been taken by me. So, what you may not have noticed actually is that the sun god is wearing boots. Now, have you ever heard of boots being used in India? If you look carefully in this close up of the statue, which I have found on the net, actually, you will find that the boots continue all the way till the bottom, and there are no fingers. The toes are not there. While you will find toes in these other statues, but this is definitely a boot. And in fact, if you
हाँ she
go
had
there
given
and check out
मौसमी मुझे ठंड लग रही थी ना
somebody needs to mute, please.
हाँ हाँ
And then on the boot itself, you will find a floral design. So this is just to tell you that there are so many things staring us in our face, and we don't register it, and we don't realize their importance or their worth, and we don't know so little about our culture. So I will now take you back to something which uh, you obviously know, and that is the Silk Route, which ran from China and India via the Arabian countries, Persia, Iraq, and so on, Turkey, and etc., to the Western countries of Europe and UK, etc. Now, this Silk Route was used for trade with India by the West, and you are well aware that the things which were most sought after from India were spices, uh, spices that had flavors which had never been tasted actually, and people got so addicted to them in the West that they really needed them in their food subsequently. Then you had zaris, which were made out of gold thread. When the rest of the world was basically heating and beating metal into shape, we were drawing it out into threads, and we were using it as embroidery, and we were in fact even putting gems etc. on the cloth. Plus the cloth was of many which had never been seen before in the rest of the world. Like you, if you see some of those olden movies, you will find them wearing all brown clothes and all very dull colors. Then there was jewelry, of a type which the world didn't know at that time how to even shape the metal in this way. So it was highly sought after jewelry, which had gems which were cut so that they flashed fire. Even cutting of stone was basically at a very high uh, level in India. So all these were flowing from India, and this is what India was famous for. And I must tell you that if you look at Wikipedia today and you just search for Silk Route, you will find that it talks about the route which was from China to the West, and India is spoken of very marginally. And it seems to be as if the Silk Route was only for the silk which was there from China, and that was what was highly sought after. And bales of silk was going from China to the West. India is hardly mentioned. Now, if India was not actually the main contributor on the Silk Route, why would the West look for a sea route to India when the Silk Route was closed after the Ottoman Empire closed it? Why did they start looking for India? Why didn't they say, let us find a sea route for China? Have you heard of anybody saying, let us, historically, that let us look for a sea route to China? Wasn't it India? Weren't countries which were found by mistake called Indies? They should have been called Chinese or China or China or something. So, this is the level to which even today our history is misrepresented, misquoted. And, even when on Discovery Channel or something, you will hear about ancient civilizations, they will say ancient civilizations like those of Egypt and China and Greece. India is not mentioned. So this, at least you as the audience who has come here to, who knows that there is something in our history which we don't know, I hope to give you some information about these things. So actually, the Silk Route was conveying something which was even more precious, which started being recognized little later down the line, particularly by the Persians and the other Arabs. And that was knowledge. A lot of knowledge passed from India to China, and from India to the Arab countries, to Greece, and then from Greece, it opened out into the West. This may be a little bit difficult for you to believe, so I would like to give you one example. Here I am giving you something from a Vedic mantra, which is not very well known in it's not in the common people's psyche. For example, you might have heard of the decimal place and of shunya, zero, having come from India. But you may not have heard that the place value notation also came from India. Place value notation of numbers is the placement of digits such that the place that they occupy in that set determines their value. For example, 5 in the units place is equal to 5. 5 in the tens place is equal to 50. 5 in the hundreds place is equal to 500, etc. So this place value notation, you can see in this Vedic mantra, which gives actually the odd numbers. Eka, Tisraha, Pancha, Sapta, Nava, Ekadasha. This Ekadasha is firstly giving you the decimal system. Also, it's saying 1 and 1. Okay, so while in Sanskrit, actually, the numerals are written in the opposite order, but when we are writing in words, but when we write them as numerals, then it is written in that same order. For example, 13 will be written as 1, 3. So this is the Vedic verse which has given this knowledge to Indians and through Indians to the world that the way to go is through place value notation. In contrast, you can think of the Roman system, which is also we are all very familiar with. So you have I as 1, and you have V as 5, you have X as 10, and then you use the left side for subtracting, and on the right side when you add, then it is to be added. So if you have to write 11, then you put X and 1, and if you have to write 9, then you put 1 and X. So this is hardly conducive for any higher maths. You can do some very limited maths, some addition, subtraction, and maybe some multiplication by standing on your head. But division, I doubt you can even do with Roman numerals. So there was so much flexibility given. It's like it automatically enables you to do maths. How much it is revered, you can see in uh, this quotation which I want to give you. So first of all, I want to tell you that actually this notation reached the West through a Persian scholar called Al-Khwarizmi in the 9th century AD. He is supposed to be the first Indologist. So, sorry, no, not him. Okay, Al-Khwarizmi, he brought in the 9th century, he took this knowledge from India to the West. And one Dutch gentleman, scientific historian by the name which I would not like to pronounce and mispronounce, and one Simon Steven, they wrote in the Science in the Netherlands around 1600. They wrote that European mathematicians, when taking over from the Hindus via the Arabs, the idea of the positional value for integers neglected to extend this idea to fractions. So this is clearly recognizing the fact that this knowledge of place value system has come from India via the Arabs. So this is the proof I wanted to give you about this fact of the knowledge flow. Also, I would like to just add a tippani here, just note that actually we used it in fractions as well. But we used to like to work with not decimal places, but Indians could, handle a lot of information in their heads. So we had pi expressed as a fraction, and you had different fractions to cover different numbers of places of decimals. So you used one fraction if you wanted zero decimal place tolerance. If you wanted 2 decimal place accuracy, you used another fraction. If you wanted 4 levels of accuracy, you used another fraction. Fraction is a good thing because it allows you to manipulate very easily with numbers, operate with numbers, multiply, divide quickly, you can do. So that is why they could work with both, but they love to work with actual fractions. Okay, this was something which is documented, we can say. Now I want to tell you some things which are not attributed to India and which I discovered during the course of my studies. So one is that we know that point is defined as having no width, length, or height in Euclid's elements. Now, this definition you can find in Bodhayan's Shulpa Sutra. This Bodhayan was a great mathematician, and he has written this text called Shulpa Sutra, which is mainly a geometrical text, and it tells how to make various varies, and so it is seen as something which is only for the fire sacrifice purposes, but that is really taking a very, very limited view of it. It covers a whole lot of things. Even Pythagoras' theorem is there. And this is conservatively um, dated as around 800 BCE. So already it is 500 years before Euclid's Elements. Similarly, Pythagoras is supposed to be 500 BCE. So again, Bodhayan's Shulpa Sutra is 300 years before Pythagoras. So we Sanskritajnas, we like to call Pythagoras' theorem as Bodhayan's theorem. Just as a side, I want to tell you. Then this atom being defined as being obtained when matter cannot be cut any further is ascribed to another Greek called Leucippus and is dated as around 450 BCE. But if you look at the Vyas Bhashya of Yoga Darshanam, you will find the same definition. And this Vyas Bhashya, I am even scared to tell you how old this is. But we date it, this Vyas as the same Vyas as probably the one who wrote Mahabharata. At the time of Mahabharata, he existed, and that is why it is dated as at around 3000 BCE. Even if we don't accept 3000 BCE, it has to be admitted that it was before 450 BCE. And so we find this also within the Indian knowledge system. Then division by zero gives infinity. You know, the concept of infinity in the West has just come about in 1655 through an English mathematician called John Wallis. But you will find this fact in Bhaskaracharya's Siddhant Shiromani, which is dated at 11,000 CE, that is AD. So you can already again see the difference. And I have to also tell you that these were not the Bhaskaracharya did not say, I have discovered this. Okay, we were always very humble and we said that this is coming down to us through Guru Parampara. So it already existed. And probably the way he tackled certain equations or series was a little different. So this book, Siddhant Shiromani, is a classic and continues to exist today and be studied. So these things are not admitted to Indians. I would now like to give you two quotes. One is from Einstein, who said, "We owe a lot to Indians who taught us how to count, without which no worthwhile scientific discovery could have been made." Einstein, of course, is one of the greatest scientists of the 20th century, one of my favorites. Also, if there is Pierre Simon Laplace, a French mathematician, who said, "How grateful we should be to the Hindus who discovered the great decimal system that did not occur to the minds of such mighty mathematicians as Archimedes and Apollonius." So these are people who know the value of things. Sometimes what happens is that we have been born and brought up with the decimal system and the numbers and the place value system, and we don't understand the importance of these things. But without this foundation, actually, mathematics could not have gone to such heights as we see today. Now, I will tell you something which is not at all recorded. It happened in such a hoary past that if I would tell somebody, they will probably not believe it. However, indications are there that it has a common origin. So, why do we all use in this part of the world? When I'm saying we all use, I really mean this Asian, African, little bit, and European and Arabic mass, where all this knowledge has spread extensively from India. Why do we all use 12 months in a year? Now, it would be very easy to say, yeah, sure, a lunar cycle is around 28, and you can make out that the solar cycle, seeing the seasons, is around 365 days. So you will automatically have 30 days and 12 months in a year. It could be done. though I don't think any Aboriginal culture actually has this kind of a calendar. However, maybe my knowledge is limited. So this is something which maybe you can ascribe to people could have come out with it on their own. However, why do we use 7 days to a week? What is this idea of a week? Why do we have this time slice called a week defined? Why is everybody using 7 days? Where is the seven coming from? Why do we use 12 zodiac signs? Why 12? Uh, Again, maybe you could say from 12 months you wanted to have one per month. That's a possibility, but you could also have six, or you could have 18, or you could have 24. And in the zodiac signs, you will find there is a one-to-one mapping between the Sanskrit ones and the modern ones. For example, Aries and Mesha, and Tula and Libra. These are one-to-one mapping, as all of you probably know from your horoscope. So how come there is so much match between them? Then why are there seven notes to a musical scale, and we have three musical scales? And as far as the major notes are concerned, they match frequency for frequency, and scientific studies are showing that this frequency is so scientific that it actually makes for melody. And if you had a different frequency in those notes, they will actually not sound so good. So, how come all of us are using the same seven notes? There is some variation in the minor notes, but the major notes are basically the same. And we are using three musical scales. Also, all our languages, except the hieroglyphic ones like Chinese and Japanese and so on, they are split very carefully into noun, verb, subject, object, preposition, adverb, adjective, and so on. These are very non-trivial concepts and huge abstractions, and they make language also very scientific. How come all of these are using the same thing? So all this shows that there is a common origin from which they are derived. So let us try and figure out what is this common origin. So we get some of these clues to this origin from the names. So, if you see the English Gregorian calendar, you have September, October, November, and December. September is Sapta, which means 7. October is 8. November is 9. December is 10. But they are not the 7th, 8th, 9th, and 12th, 9th and 10th months. So, they are referring to another calendar in which they were the 7th, 8th, 9th, and 10th months. And you know, the in the Indian calendar we start with Chaitra, which occurs now in the middle of March or so. But maybe at some time in the past it might have been in the beginning of March. So these adjectives would be correct for that calendar. Also, I would like to point out to you actually that while you know, July is based on is named after Julius Caesar, and August is named after Augustus Caesar, and some of those other months are also named after some gods or high personages, except the September, October, November, December. Ours are named after the constellations which are in the ascendant. So in Chaitra, the Chitra Nakshatra is on the ascendant. On in Vaishak, the Vishakha Nakshatra is in the ascendant. So highly scientific name has been given to our months. It is not a meaningless name like some of these other ones. Nothing historical about it. Now let us look at days of the week. So in Sanskrit, for Sunday we say Ravivasara, for Monday we say Somavasara. Similar names are there in Hindi as well. In Saturday we say Shanivasara. Now Sun and Ravi, they are the same. Soma is another name for moon, and that moon has become Man. Monday was actually Moon Day. Then Shani is Saturn, and that is what has made Saturn Day Saturday. So again, you can see one linkage is there between our names and their names, which again makes no sense. Ours is named based on our Jyotish Shastra, but they would have no such connection. if they were not following the Jyotishas that we were following, which is highly difficult to believe that, two independent systems will come out saying that Saturday should be named after Saturn. Okay, then I want to also tell you about one very interesting word called Ahoratra, which I'm sure all of you are familiar with, which means the 24-hour day. It is made up of two parts, Ahana and Ratri. Ahana stands for daytime in Sanskrit, and Ratri is night, as you know. So together, when you do the Sandhi, it becomes Ahoratra. So it covers the full 24-hour day. Now, this Ahoratra, the Jyotish Shastrajnas who were there, Shastrajnas, they needed to use this period all the time. So they got very irritated and they said, this 4-syllable thing is too long for us. Let us change it to a smaller word. And they made it, they removed the A and they removed the Tra and they said Hora. So this Hora reached the West and transformed into hour. So the hour which we know today has come from Hora. Now, if you ask from where hour has come, they will tell you from the Greek horos, which stands for time. So again, if you ask from where horos has come, you will not get an answer because it has come from Ahoratra. And from horos, you get horology, you get horoscope, and so on. Horology is science of time, measurement of time, study of time. Horoscopes, you are well aware of. So this again is showing very clearly from where knowledge has originated and where it has ended. But the ultimate origin of all these are the Vedas. It is even more difficult for us to believe that the Vedas could be the origin for all of this. So therefore, I would like to give you one more verse from the Vedas. Here you will find that the decimal system is given Eka, Dasha, Shatam, Sahasram, and so on. These are powers of 10. They go right up to Parardha. This Parardha is 10 to the power 17. Now, whatever dating you want to give the Vedas, 2,500 years old, just at the time of Jesus almost, and maybe 5,000 years old, or as per Indian tradition, as with the start of mankind, whatever time you may give it, the importance of this cannot be overstated. What a huge concept this is, you can understand from one more quote by Al-Baruni. This was again a Persian thinker, philosopher, mathematician. He followed Mahmud of Ghazni. When Mahmud of Ghazni was invading India, he came along with him to record the events. He was also a historian. He wrote Tarikh-e-Hind. In that, he says that I have studied the names of the orders of the numbers in various languages with all kinds of people with whom I have been in contact, and have found that no nation goes beyond the 1,000. Arabs too stop with the 1,000. Those who go beyond the 1,000 in the numerical system are the Hindus. They extend the names of the order of the numbers until the 18th order. The 18th order is called Parardha, that is the half of heaven, or more accurately, the half of that which is above. This last bit, of course, we can forget about. That is not very, very true. But you can just imagine in 1000 CE, they were still just at 1000, while we were talking of 10 to the power 17. In fact, I would like to actually show you one more thing. This Eka, which is there here, this is 10 to the power 0. So you were already introduced to Shunya here, and 10 to the power 0 is recognized as 1. This in itself is a huge mathematical learning. it is not at all trivial. So this again, the Vedas have given us. So this is the way of the Vedas. This is how Vedic mantras give in a style which is poetic. They will not say use the decimal system 1, 2, 3, 4 and so on. They give in a poetic style. It is meant to be interpreted by intelligent people. When stupid people take over interpreting the Vedas, they interpret it. There is a dhenavaha here. They say that they are talking of cows, but this is not talking of cows. And this to interpret the Vedas, you really need to know a lot more before you can start interpreting. Okay. I think I'm running a little short on time, so I will skip over this little bit. We shall proceed, or let me tell you quickly.
It's 6:07, so it doesn't matter. You can take your time.
Okay,
We
so
are halfway through.
in astronomy, if we look at the advances which were there in India since time immemorial, we cannot say when, because even in the Vedas we find a lot of information. So we knew about the six inner planets. Actually, the six inner planets were known by the ancient world in other places as well. Probably the knowledge had gone from India. I may be biased, of course, since I can see that a lot of knowledge has gone from India. However, let us give them credit too. But the fact that they are revolving around the sun and the sun's gravitational attraction is the one which is making them move. As you are well aware, these are very, very latter day concepts. Galileo, Copernicus, and so on have talked about it so late. And this planets going, particularly Earth, which has been mentioned in the Vedas, going around the sun due to its akarshan is mentioned in several mantras. Rotation of the Earth was well known. In fact, actually, after this 1000 C, Mahmud of Ghazni, once he took over parts of Pakistan and so on, and the empire started building. Since then, actually, a reverse flow of knowledge happened, and we started taking in from the Arabs. And in later texts, you will find there is a discussion going on: does the Earth move around the sun, or the sun move around the Earth? So this was actually the degradation of Indian knowledge since the time around 1000 AD, and particularly around 12th century AD. Things really started going down the tube, and we are where we are today, and we have forgotten that we knew all this. Then the revolution of the sun in the Milky Way was known to some extent. And revolution periods of the planets were actually encoded in the names of the planets. So, Saturn is known as Shani. And this is because among these six inner planets, it has the smallest, the biggest revolution period of 29 and a half Earth years. So it is the slowest of the inner six planets. So it was called Shani from the Sanskrit shabd Shaneh. Shaneh means Shaneh, Shaneh, you would be aware of slowly. So from Shaneh, Shani was derived. Similarly, Jupiter was called Guru, which means large, because it is the largest planet in the solar system. So, from the words itself, you can figure out the amount of knowledge which was there. Now, just looking at the skies with your naked eyes, you cannot make these deductions. Okay, a revolution maybe you could by watching the movement of Saturn in the sky, but something like Jupiter being the largest one, you could not have discovered without the use of telescopes, etc. A lot of information has got lost over a period of time. You are aware of the burning of the libraries of Takshashila and Nalanda. With them, a whole lot of knowledge is gone. And with all these invasions, we have lost a lot of scholars in the bargain as well. And so we have forgotten a lot of things. I will like to tell you some of the things which are now being looked at and being proven to a very, very limited extent. Some studies which are kind of looking at the available information and then trying to make out why it is so great. So you have all heard of the iron pillar of Meroli, and it never rusts. The miracle about this is that this is 98% pure iron, which should not allow it to be rust proof. 98% pure iron has to rust, particularly with the kind of carbon content which this pillar has. So what was also this pillar is around 1600 years old at a conservative estimate, but it may be 3000 years. Like so many things about India, since our history is so poorly studied, as well as so little information is available to us coming down, our libraries etc having all been um, destroyed. Everything is, you know, a little bit open. So it's probably 3000 years, but we cannot prove it 100%. So one professor, R. Balasubramaniam, did a very detailed study along with a team from IIT Kanpur. He was a professor at IIT Kanpur, and they discovered that the unique thing about this pillar was that it has a very high phosphorus content. What that meant was that this phosphorus would leach out with weathering. The content on the outside would become even greater, and this would form a film of iron hydrogen phosphate hydrate, which also over a period of time would become crystalline. This crystal film has to be found to be very uniform over the pillar, and the really amazing thing about this film is that it actually increases with age. So, with the weathering cycles of wet and dry seasons, the wet season dissolves out the phosphorus from inside the iron, brings it to the surface, and that further adds another layer to the top of the iron. So, this uh, iron becomes more, this pillar becomes more rust proof with age. Also, it is being found that we cannot, with our current technology, create iron with this high phosphorus content, because in the blast furnace we use a lime uh, for a certain process for to remove certain things that removes phosphorus as well. So you cannot achieve this high content of phosphorus even today. These people used to use some wood, it seems, and that too high phosphorus content wood was used in the preparation of this iron, and that technology is no longer available. So at the end of his study, Professor Balasubramaniam said that the pillar is a living testimony to the skill of the metallurgists of ancient India. I think I don't need to add anything here. Then I would like to introduce you to a very brilliant spectrometer. This came to my attention somehow by chance when I was studying some old Indic journals. So there is this Professor N.G. Dongre, who was working for the Saha Industrial Research and Institute in Varanasi. He picked up Maharshi Bharadwaj's Yantra Sarvasva, of which a part is called Anshu Bodhini, which described a spectrometer. So, given the specs which he somehow got, he built the spectrometer, actually constructed it. Then he discovered to his amazement that not only does it cover the visible spectrum, but it also covers the ultraviolet and the infrared regions of the spectrum. It has actually a conical prism. These plates that you see over here are actually forming a prism. And this is circular. So there is a circular symmetry to this whole thing. When we take a prism, you know, it is triangular, so it is not symmetrical. Which way you pass a light makes a difference to what you will get at the other end. But this being circular, it led to a symmetry, because of which it allowed the wave number of the light to be directly read on a linear scale. And another amazing part of this was that these things which you are seeing over here allowed you to change the range for which you used the spectrometer, the frequency range for which you wanted to use it. So at the end of it, Professor Dongre, his conclusion in the paper was, this was a paper which was published in the Indian Journal of History of Science in 1994. He concludes that the above description of Dvanta Pramapaka Yantra reveals that one, the nature and properties of the ultraviolet, visible, and infrared radiations were well known in ancient India. Um, did I tell you that these texts were 800? This Yantra Sarvasva is supposed to be of 800 AD, which is also a very conservative estimate. Actually, it is more likely to be older than that. So he has said that the nature and properties of the ultraviolet, visible, and infrared radiations were well known in ancient India. They knew the properties and methods of preparation of materials useful in such radiation studies. And presumably, they also knew the theory and practice of this and other four types of spectrometer. Above all, the instrument itself is an entirely new design of spectrometer not prevalent in modern scientific world. This again, it tells us that today also we have things to learn from the ancient world, and maybe there are parts of this spectrometer which could improve our design today. Then I want to discuss the musical pillars of Hampi. A number of you would have visited Hampi, which is a historical city close to Bangalore, which was the capital of the famed Vijayanagar Empire. Here, this one was built in 1400 C by Devaraya II. In the 14th century, this was constructed. So there is a Vitthal temple over there, and in the courtyard, you have these strange looking pillars. The pillars do support the rock ceiling which is there. At the same time, they are split into these columns. Some of them have a single column, and but most of them are divided into multiple columns of different thickness and different height. And when you tap on them even lightly, you get a musical note, and all the saregama pa are can be generated here. Not only that, different musical instruments can be played over here. So here again, one study was done by Indira Gandhi Center of Atomic Research and National Institute of Advanced Studies. They did a vibration analysis study only, and they found that they treated the monolithic pillar, that means the full pillar from top to bottom, as a bar which has been clamped at both ends, and based on that, they did their this analysis. They found that actually all the columns within that pillar were coupled. So if you stuck one column in the pillar, all the columns started resonating. And this coupling had the impact that the vibration lasted much longer. So it actually produced music. So of course we don't know how to produce such kind of pillars. We don't know what is the special composition. Most likely it has some special ingredients. Those little bit of knowledge, information is there about that, but very very little. We really need to study more and figure out how this works. Also, I would like to tell you about the acoustics of Golconda Fort, which again so many of you would have visited and I would be familiar with. That the guide will take you on to some balcony, and he will, which is around 1 kilometers from the main gate, and somebody at the main gate will just snap the fingers, and you can hear very clearly. And if you snap the fingers there, you can hear over there. So, see, these whispering galleries are very common around the world, because when you have domes, etc., then the sound moving around and creating an echo is not such a difficult thing. But this is in an open area. As far as I know, this is the only place in the world where, in an open area, you have this kind of a thing where, with so much ambient sound, you can still hear one small sound from about a kilometer away, which even in a empty road you will not be able to hear. So, what is it that these people knew? What is this special technique by which we can hear this. This technology, by the way, is not attributed to Indians currently, because this fort was made by Qutub Shahi kings, and it is said that the Persian architects, they came over and they constructed this, and they are the ones who did this. I have my doubts about this. Anyway, whoever may have constructed this, it is still a technology which we could use today. If we discovered how this happens, how nice it would be to have it in the stadium, right? Virat Kohli does a tick on the bat and you can hear it so clearly all around the stadium. How well we could use it. So we should study it, I think. Now I will take you a little bit deeper into something which is very known very little. Those were things which I told you were partially studied. Now this is directly from the Vedas, where it says, the Vedic mantra says that these separate past, present, and future are comprehended sequentially by the immortal mind. So this is from a very famous sukt in Yajurveda called Shiva Sankalpa Sukta, in which this is the um, repeating quarter of the verse, which says that mind of mine which can do all these great things, may it think, want to do only good things, be motivated to do only good things. That is the prayer in this. So here it says, Yenedam Bhutam Bhuvanam Bhavishyat. Bhutam past, Bhuvanam present, and Bhavishyat is future. All these are comprehended sequentially by the immortal mind. So, what it is pointing to you is that actually there is very little, there's no substance like time which is running through all these. But these are separate things which are existing, which the mind has the capability of stitching them together and showing it to you as a continuum. Now, this idea has been broached recently, and one physicist called Julian Barbour has said that change merely creates an illusion of time, with each individual moment existing in its own right, complete and whole. So we are arriving at similar conclusions. You can also, if you go back and think about it, you will realize that there is no such thing as time. Something is changing, and that change, that sequence, is interpreted as time. Actually, it is just a change. So I have shown you now many verses from the Vedas and how they are pointing us in the right direction. Swami Dayanand Saraswati of the Arya Samaj has said that the Vedas are the book of all eternal knowledge. I've also shown you how the Vedas provide present knowledge in a very, today, in a very codified way, we would consider. And it requires very intelligent interpretation to understand from those verses. Finally, to conclude, I would say that for too long, all the knowledge that Bharat has shared freely with the world, and today other people are taking credit for all that, and other people's names are going on all the concepts which came out of Bharat, has lain unacknowledged. It is time to correct this. We need to stand up. I told you that even in Wikipedia regarding the Silk Route, they are making out as if it was not India, which was the main hub from which people were trading. It's as if it was China and China's silk. It is laughable, in my opinion. Also, a lot of knowledge continues to remain hidden in our texts, our monuments, our heritage. We need to research these for aspects potentially beneficial for mankind and other living beings. I think you would have gathered that from the various examples which I have given you. I have given you just a small sample. I'm sure you can understand that there is such a vast amount of information. Some of it is just staring in our faces. Some of it we need to dig up old texts and study them. The problem has also been, Sanskritajnas are not of a scientific temperament. So we need to bring in this interdepartmental collaboration. where you have the Sanskrit Rachna telling you what the Sanskrit means, and then some physicists and mathematicians and even biologists need to come together and actually understand what is being said. That is where the big gap is in today's time. So that is, I would like to conclude with that, but would like to tell you to please remember India is the one who taught science and spirituality to the world. Let us return to that tradition. Let us return to Dharma. Let us return to the Vedas. Thank you very much. Please visit my website, indianvedas.net, also my YouTube channel, Indian Vedas. And these are the 3 books which are available on Amazon, Flipkart, Smashwords, etc., all over the world, not only India. Anywhere you can pick them up from. Om Shanti.